Salvete omnes, and welcome to this week's video tutorial. We're going to continue with our reading, going over just a few lines for today in Ovid, in particular his unique story of Narcissus and Echo. So I'm using the text via Latin library, and so I'm just going to follow this to Book 3. As you can see, the Metamorphoses consists of 15 books. And the lines or story that we're interested in begin on 339. So as we said before, sorry about that. As we said before, one of the goals for this is to actually read Latin, and certainly to consider translation. But when we're reading, we're not translating, we're comprehending, we're thinking, we're interpreting. So let's keep that goal in mind as we go through this here. So here's where we started, and we talked about the first few lines last time. For the final exam, you will have to write a short essay response of interpretation about the text. This text, like Ovid's book as a whole, raises many interesting questions. Just some of the questions to consider is about adolescence. I can tell from, or rather I can say from many years of teaching different ages of students, and of course my own experiences, that the transition from adolescence to adulthood is not an easy one. There have been many significant studies, for example, about the origins and predominance of youth culture, in particular in the United States. Hollywood, California, the Californication, to use a reference by the Red Hot Chili Peppers. Many people, even though they're of a certain older age, emotionally, spiritually, mentally, existentially, just never adjust or adapt or grow into more mature human beings. Now, by that we mean, in this particular case, the ironization of the words of Plato and Socrates, if he does not know himself that and Ovid no doubt was aware of this, that, and we talked about this briefly in passing last time, that for Plato, self-knowledge is the beginning of true education. That one becomes aware of oneself as a human being, which for Plato means a moral, even spiritual being. And that's when one begins to mature beyond a mere physical existence. In this story, of course, that transition, that rite of passage, that recognition, instead of initiating or beginning such a journey, goes in a different direction, and ultimately, because he can never get beyond himself, he never matures into a more interesting, deeper, spiritually understood human being. Another way to read this, of course, before we get into the Latin, is, because there's a lot going on here, but we're just brainstorming and having a brief conversation about some of the things that you might want to think about as you come up with an interpretation and not merely a summary of the story, is the enduring conflict between love and society. In this story, of course, and that's part of maturation, not quite as explicit, but it still, relates to Ovid's own story of Paramus and Thisbe, which anticipates by many centuries Shakespeare's Romeo and Juliet, and how love, in a individual, personal way, never seems to be able to transition to a kind of community, that is, where love serves as a model or image of broader human community. Another great example of this is Tolstoy's novelistic creation, Anna Karenina, which is just a tour de force and like Shakespeare and Ovid, a psychological study of the impossibilities of love because the forces external to the lover or lovers are just too strong and ultimately destroy the belief in love itself, and hence any sense of happiness based on love. So those are just a couple of thoughts that you might want to consider in terms of why I think Ovid still is worth reading, is that he is one of the first writers in Western civilization to recognize problems of living that are still haunting us. All right, so with that said, let's take a look at a little bit of the Latin. I've also pulled up some translations, which is good to do just to kind of get us thinking about the Latin. But again, our goal is to read Latin, if you will. So we ended, I can't remember exactly where we ended right here, but here is De Quo Consultus. Remember, that's a reference to Tiresias, who's not mentioned by name, but he is mentioned in the previous story. We talked about that last time. So he's consulted, and he's consulted about Narcissus, who was born, and whether or not he would live a long life. In other words, whether he would see the Visuros. Of course, already right there, we anticipate the ironic destruction of this impossibility, because when he sees himself in the waters, instead of leading to a mature life, it actually leads to his death. And so he was asked whether, here's our future participle, whether he would live literally long years and mature age, whether he would live a long and you might even say happy life, but long and a wise life. And then this is kind of language actually that we also see in Virgil in the Aeneid. Again, it's a reference to Tiresias, the fastidious father or the seer, fatiticus fates. Again, as always, please use a dictionary or Whitaker's Words or whatever online dictionary to look up these words. It does have a kind of allusion to fate. You can see the words here, F-A-T. And there was that his prediction proves fatalistic for Narcissus. And as we've already said a number of times, that literally if he will not know himself, in other words, that if he does not see himself, if he does not know himself, because he is merely image, and part of the process of maturation or growing up is to bring form to our feelings, to our senses, to our images. I think that's part of life. Take, for example, the idea of freedom, American freedom. Clearly, freedom is not a thing or an object, but a feeling. And the American story, which is still going on, and one day when it is no longer going on, future peoples will look back at Americans and see them striving for some image of freedom which doesn't exist but is meaningful, and hence is expressed and represented by the way they live their lives, or also, of course, by the way we don't live our lives. So, Vana Dio visa es vox auguris. Dio, of course, means, we've seen this before. You no doubt have encountered this, whether in the Whitaker's, or excuse me, Wheelock's Latin or whatever. It means for a long time, duration. So for a long time, what? That literally the voice of the augur. Remember, an augur is a kind of religious position, but also it's talking again about Tiresias. So for a long time, the voice of Tiresias, or the voice of the seer. Here is our participle. Visa s means seemed vain. In other words, seemed empty. What that means is it didn't seem to come about, or it didn't seem to come true. The prophecy of Narcissus's downfall didn't seem to be fulfilled. So literally empty for a long time seemed voice of augur. Put it all together. And again, when you look at different translations, you'll see that for a long time, the prophecy or voice of Tiresias didn't seem fulfilled or didn't seem to come about. Exitus, but then it came about. So there's that quick transition. Just when you think that it's not going to happen, it happens. That's kind of how life is in one sense, certainly in this story. And what came about that thing proved true. In other words, that then it came about that thing proved true. So then his prophecy proved true. And then what was the prophecy? Literally a kind of death. This is where we get the word lethal. And so we have que. We have kind of two different ideas here. So a kind of death and literally a novel kind of fury, a novel kind of madness. That Narcissus's death is strange, to say the least. I mean, I don't know about you, but I've never seen, or I don't know of anybody who died by looking at themselves in a pool of water. I know people who have died by drowning, and I know people have died by many means, but I've never heard, or I don't know of anybody personally who died just because he or she was unable to retract oneself from one's own mirror image. Now, of course, as we think about this in broader psychological terms, we do know people who die, both literally and metaphorically and symbolically, because of narcissism, because of selfishness, because of lack of love or lack of community. I know people who probably waste away because of loneliness. In fact, that's an important word, I think, to understand the genius of this story is just how lonely and isolated both Narcissus and Echo, whom we'll learn about later, are from genuine community as realized by love. And then here we talked about four. This is 3, like tertios, for 3, 2, 4, 1 of Cephisus year was added, and boy was able to seem a young man. So this one, the Latin is a little bit tricky. The idea is clear, is that I read a commentary one time kind of suggesting this was kind of like a math problem. But really it represents adolescence. He's 16 years old. How do we know that? Because 3 times 5, quinque. 3 times 5 is 15 plus 1 is 16. And if you think about your own lives, I'm sure you'll agree that 16 years of age is a kind of rite of passage. It's when a lot of people start to drive. It's when you start to have some sense of life beyond high school. It's when you have some sense that you're actually going to have to enter into society and you can't live under your parents' roof your entire time. So it's, not that childhood is over, but in one sense it is. And then, of course, the challenge, which doesn't work out happily in this story, is, will one continue that journey? Again, not by discounting childhood, but will one become a more mature human being? By the way, as a footnote, a lot of fairy tales suggest a similar kind of symbolic logic. Namely, you have to go into the woods and you have to kill the witch, and as part of the process of moral development. So these are sort of enduring ideas. I think that this just to show you how easy this, or rather how difficult this is. Take education. You guys are in higher ed right now, and you guys are doing fine. But we know that many people throughout human history, for a lot of reasons, and it's not so simple if they were given opportunities, but do they ever learn to read deeply? Do they ever learn to think deeply? Do they ever learn to create deeply? Well, it's not that simple because, in one sense, a lot of people who do have certain abilities, they're merely copying the words or the ideas or the methods of others. Take something like medicine. All due respect to medical doctors, I have many who are friends, but they'll be the first to tell you is they have learned the techniques, but they didn't create the techniques. So they put them into practice, but a lot of times these are other people's achievements. These are other people's ideas that they're implementing. And so it raises profound questions about, when we talk about creative intelligence, exactly what do we mean by that? Is there any kind of originality, any kind of individuality, any kind of uniqueness, authenticity, if you will, in one's existence? Well, these are all kind of suggested here, that there's a turning point that this part of the story illustrates, and this is just part of growing up that all people have to face, or most people have to face in some measure. So when you add it all together, he's 16 years old, and when you're 16, that he seemed to be um, um, a young, here it kind of suggests that he seemed to be a youthful adolescent. But they give us more information here is that, so he was able to seem, kind of, both attractive, as you'll see, to males and females, because many young men and many girls were desiring him. And so that's sort of we have a colon here, which gives us more information about what kind of appearance he seemed. He seemed to be at such an age that he was attractive to both boys and girls. Not quite a man or a woman, because he's only 16, but no longer a child either. And so he seems to represent something universal and yet something individual, which, if you think about it, I think adolescence is that in many senses. So this line here is pretty straightforward. So many, here's our direct object, illum, second declension, accusative singular. Here we have just the third declension, nominative plural. Same thing here, first declension, nominative plural, adjective, and then first declension, nominative plural, noun, and then we have the verb kind of being used in both of these clauses here, which is common in poetry. It's where we get the word cupid or desire. We've seen this before. So many young men and women were wanting him. But there's always a but, right? So just when you think, we've seen this before, just when you think his words aren't going to come true, they come true. Just when you think that all is going to be good and he's going to be loved and have friends with all, but. So that's very common in Ovid, where just when you think something might be going okay, we look a little deeper, not so much. So literally, but was in hold, so hard, arrogant form. So what does that even mean? Is that he was so obdurate, or he was so taken by his own superiority of form. In other words, he knew that he was good looking. And again, when you look at translations of this, you can come up with something better. But he was, so I might, as a free translation right here. So here's our verb in third person plural. This is our subject, and this is our adjective, and then we have some how is he? So, and then we have some adverbs here. So, but he was held, or not held, but he was enamored. I might even say enamored for antenna, but he was enamored. He was enamored so greatly by his own arrogant form, or he was enamored so greatly by his own beauty, would be kind of the idea here. So we might even say with that. But he was enamored so greatly by his own beauty that, so we have to kind of often put a that to kind of continue the idea here, that literally none of the young men and none of the young women were able to touch him. In other words, that he kept them at a distance. So because he was so caught up by his own narcissism or by his own superiority of form, which of course is the prophecy that Tiresias says. Here we can relate. We can go back. Hopefully, it's less the case with you guys as in college, but in high school, the girl that's too good for you, or the boy that is too cool for you, or however you want to look at it. But this is a common sentiment in adolescence, where people, it's one thing not to like somebody, but to be arrogant or to be impolite, that suggests something moral and not merely amorous, if you will. So you can see right here the moral deterioration already in Narcissus, that's already present because his arrogance of youthful beauty is already sort of colliding and undermining his development or growth as a moral being, as we talked about earlier. And you can see that he's already doomed to not really live in a moral way because he cannot get beyond the physical. So he's trapped in matter, and he's ultimately not becoming human in any moral or spiritual sense. But then, just when you think, okay, well, he doesn't like those, he doesn't want to be friends with those dudes, and he's not interested in those girls or whatever, then Echo sees him. So she enters into his logic. So Echo is the subject of here, and she sees him driving scared deers, so trepidos cervos, into a net. Vocales nymphae, so a talkative nymph, who, so the word order on here is a little bit tricky. So we have to recognize that Echo is the subject. And again, if you don't know that, when you look at translations, you'll see that. So notice our verbs are in the third person singular, which agree with the subject here. So the resounding echo, notice she's sound, that's why she's called Echo. That this resounding echo, resonabilis echo, it actually sounds much better in Latin. So et spicit hunc trepidos agitantam in retia cervos. Vocalis nymphae quae nec reticicere loquenti. Nec prior ipsa loqui didicit resonabilis echo. Notice the brilliance here, even this didicit, this kind of like echoes in terms of, we have the didicit, d is an echo, and of course we have echo here. Ovid, like all great writers, there are no accidents. Every word is there for a creative reason. And so that's what the greatest writers do, is they don't have any fat, they don't have any words that are going to not stand the test of time, and they're so chiseled in their word choice and hence imagery that's what makes them classic. So going back to the idea here is, again, use image, not translation, that we have this idea of a rather resounding echo who sees him. So hunk sees the hunk, if you will. So how about that, right? Although hunk is not a word that Ovid, but we'll go with it. So she sees the hunk Narcissus, and what is he doing? That he is driving. So notice that this is second declension, or rather this is our demonstrative pronoun in the accusative, and then we have our participle also in the accusative third declension. So he is driving these scared deer, into a net, trying to capture them. So he's trying to capture the deer, and boys and girls in Echo are trying to capture him. So they're all sort of trapped in this web of desire, and the image is striking indeed. And so she's a rather talkative nymph who, now this clause right here is a little bit tricky. She's not able to recite, or she's not able to talk without first being taught to speak by words that are returned to her. And so literally, who neither recite of talking nor before herself to talk was taught. And so again, that's tricky to translate, but the idea here is that who was not able to speak without first being spoken to, because she can only return the words of others. In fact, I think as you read here that in our story, the most words that she can speak are 4. And so when, as we'll see later, when Narcissus says, where are you? Or who are you? She just says, you. And then she says, why are you following me? And she says, follow me. And so it takes on a kind of haunting quality here. So if we look at a couple translations of this, you'll see that, now this is probably the least satisfactory translation, but it is by Tufts University. It's kind of but that's okay. It's still something to think about. Let's see, if we look at the parts we did today. So here's that prophecy by Tiresias, going back to Plato's idea of self-knowledge. If he but fail to recognize himself, a long life he may have beneath the sun. So little things like this, we don't see beneath the sun. So if we go back to the original Latin was, where is it right here? Oh, so this is the line they're talking about right here. There's no sun in that line. So if he will see literally a long life and maturity of years is the literal translation. You can see probably a better translation for this is right here. This one is a more modern, and this is the Poetry Foundation. So shouldn't surprise us that whoever did this one, is pretty good with their English. And so if we look right here, being consulted as to whether the child would live a long life to a ripe old age. So you can see, and I think we even talked about this last time, is that long life to a ripe old age, one, it just seems better English, and so it's going to be probably more satisfactory to us in terms of the translation. Here, so frivolous the prophet's words appeared. So frivolous the prophet's words appeared, and yet the event, the manner of his death, the strange delusion of his frenzied love confirmed it. 3 times 5 years so were past, another 5 years, and the lad might seem a young man or a boy. Now this one actually doesn't quite capture the math, but the idea is similar, that he's coming of age. But this would make him 20, and that's actually less than the math, which is 16. Plus, when you're 20, I don't know if you're adolescents, you're already an adult, or more so than an adolescent. If you're in college, it's different than being in high school. And many a youth and many a damsel, again, I don't know, for puellae, I don't know about damsel, that seems too Frenchified, sought to gain his love, but such his mood and spirit and his pride, none gained his favor. So again, this one is a little bit better. And again, I would encourage you to look at other translations, but For a long time, the augur's pronouncement appeared empty words, but in the end it proved true, the outcome and the cause of his death, and the strangeness of his passion. 1 year, the son of Capheseus had reached 16. It might seem both boy and youth. So this one actually is very nice because it helps us understand. It might seem both boy and youth. So boy and youth. So when he had reached 16, we already talked about the math in that. So we go back to many youths and many young girls desired him, but there was such intense pride. So there's the idea of the superbia forma, intense pride. But there was such intense pride in that delicate form that none of the youths or young girls affected him. In that delicate form, which is interesting. I like that because it's the fact that he does die and he never matures. There is that sense that he, like a narcissus, is a delicate bud or flower that just is not going to last long. And then one day the nymph Echo saw him driving frightened deer into his nets, she of the echoing voice. So she of the echoing voice, that's how they're translating vocalis nymphae. So that's literally a talkative nymph. She of the echoing voice. This one here, a noisy nymph, which seems less poetic, quite frankly. But still work. This is still a good translation, given the skill, as you know, it requires to translate Latin. Oops, sorry about that. One day the nymph Echo saw him drive deer into his net, she of that echoing voice, who cannot be silent. So here's the tricky clause, who cannot be silent when others have spoken. So let's see, who cannot be silent when others have spoken. So that's this right here. So she's not able to be reticent, which means silence in English. Who is not able to be silent when others have spoken. So when others have spoken, so that's this loqui right here. Nor learn how to speak first herself. So here, actually, this one is nice right here, just because it kind of tells you as you come to the end of your Latin at Campbell. When others have spoken, I think this is the hardest part of Latin. It's even hard for me. Is Latin just has one word, and then you're supposed to come up with some clause because English has a relative pronoun and a verb, and so I think the participles are the hardest part in Latin. And as I said, they're still tricky for me just because English just doesn't use them, and English requires word order, not inflection to create meaning. Nor learn how to speak first herself. This one is fairly straightforward, I think. So nor prior ipse. And then notice the loqui kind of does double duty again. So that's it for today. I think we covered some interesting aspects of interpretation and Latin. Again, as I'll point out per email, the goal is to get to 401 for the final exam. So if you want to, we said here, to anticipate, this is the death of Echo, which anticipates the death of Narcissus. It is sound which lives in her. So her lament of her inability to find love and happiness in relationship with Narcissus. All right, that's it for today. Please enjoy. We still have, not everybody has taken the last test as yet, so I haven't posted the grades yet in case I need to curve it. But once everybody takes the test, I will put your grades on there. And in the meantime, enjoy reading Ovid.